The last stand of the Filipino scouts, how 500 men delayed Japan's advance for weeks. The atmosphere was the sound of defeat. Not the victorious roar of the invader, but the quiet, systematic failure of the defense. Every night, the humid air of Luzon carried the sound of muffled explosions, bridges going up, depots being scorched, and beneath that, the flat, hopeless static of the failing radio network. It was the sound of the world shrinking, pulling away from the soldiers left behind. In early 1942, the coastal towns were smoldering ashes. Manila had fallen, not with a great battle, but with the hollow sigh of a door swinging shut. Every road south of the capital was a clogged, desperate artery of retreat toward the sanctuary of Bataan. The main units, battered and broken, were trying to execute the strategic plan. War Plan Orange 3 WPO3 hold the Japanese advance long enough for the forces to consolidate on the Bataan Peninsula. But for WPO3 to work, time had to be bought. And time was the only currency the Allies had entirely run out of. The last cavalry, a lesson in obsolescence. Captain Mateo Ramos watched the last of the regular army columns pass, a blur of exhausted dust, worn vehicles, and the haunted faces of men who knew they were running a losing race. Ramos and his scouts, the 500 men of his command, drawn mostly from the storied 26th Cavalry Philippine Scouts, stood aside from the main retreat, perched on a narrow, forgotten ridge. The scouts were an anachronism. They were the proud, professional descendants of cavalry tradition, elite, disciplined, and expert in terrain they alone mastered. Yet, the war had rendered their history obsolete. Their horses, magnificent, well-cared-for beasts, were now mostly pack mules, used to haul demolition stores and move wounded men, their tactical role destroyed by the Japanese air superiority and tanks. Ramos's unit had been peeled off the main line of retreat by a desperate, last-minute order. The ridge they occupied, Punto del Daga, was a high, forested spine overlooking a backroad that ran perilously close to the main assembly routes into Bataan. If the Japanese bypassed the choking retreat on the coast and found this backroad, if they gained the high ground, the entire strategic concentration on the peninsula would unravel. Ramos had seen the intelligence brief. The Japanese advance was running days ahead of the worst-case scenario. Their target date for neutralizing the Bataan defenses was impossibly close. Sir, Lieutenant Gomez, his former constabulary officer, stated, his eyes fixed on the distant, flickering flares from the occupied towns. We are supposed to be mounted reconnaissance. Now we are a fixed defensive block. We are not equipped for this kind of attrition. Ramos, running his hand over the worn, stitched leather of his map case, felt the truth of Gomez's words. Their small command was armed with a mix of aged Springfield rifles, a few precious light machine guns, and very limited mortar shells. They were a razor, suddenly tasked with acting as a wall. We are not a fixed block, Lieutenant, Ramos corrected, his voice a low, hard rasp. We are a tripwire. We are a deliberate complication. The forge, crafting the strategic delay. Their purpose was laid bare, their stand wasn't about victory, it was about time. The ridge became a silent, furious forge of resistance. Under the suffocating humidity and the constant, low thrum of distant war, the men began to change the land around them. Sergeant Cruz, the demolition expert and former miner, became the high priest of this new religion of delay. His men, the miners, worked with a near-religious focus, turning the natural terrain into weaponized friction. Every charge is not about destruction, Captain, Cruz explained, running his hands over the smooth, hard surface of a large boulder they had positioned on a precarious slope. It is about the wasting of Japanese engineering hours. The landslide traps, massive jungle trees, Ipil and Nara, were partially felled, their trunks supported by wedges and thin cords tied to tripwires crossing the narrow backroad. A single, unseen snap could bring down tons of lumber, creating a barrier that required a full day of heavy labor to clear. The psychological minefield. Lacking enough mines to cover the entire road, they salted the approaches with improvised contact charges and simple bamboo spike pits, meticulously concealed. The objective was not to destroy every truck, but to enforce a total, crippling cautiousness, to make the Japanese engineers assume every foot of road was lethal. The deep defense. They dug deep, narrow slit trenches and covered dugouts, rejecting any notion of large, visible emplacements that would attract air fire. The men became a part of the earth, indistinguishable from the roots and clay. The foresters, led by Corporal Dela Cruz, established the eyes of the clock. They scaled the vast canopies, setting up observation posts so expertly camouflaged that they disappeared entirely. They monitored not just the roads, but the jungle's language, the sudden, unnatural silence, the shift in bird patterns, the faintest sound of a footfall on wet earth. The hard calculus. Ramos spent hours with his sergeants poring over the battered map, calculating the yield of their sacrifices. "We are not designed for a siege," Ramos stated, tracing a line with a muddy finger. "We are designed for a week of controlled withdrawal. Every engagement must be a maximum penalty on the enemy with a minimum cost to us." This led to the doctrine of dispersed deployment, the complete negation of conventional defense. The 500 men were now 30 autonomous, hyper-aware cells, spread across the high ground and the flanking ravines. They communicated primarily by runner and low-frequency, coded radio bursts, making them impossible to pin down, strafe, or neutralize with a single strike. The weight of the decision, however, was immense. Ramos knew that every scout who fell, every bullet fired, was not for a glorious victory, but for a simple, terrifying calculation, hours bought. He remembered the final, terse instruction passed down: "The overall plan demands you prevent flanking movement for as long as humanly possible. Our fate rests on your friction." Ramos stared out at the dark, silent valley. Somewhere down there, the Japanese advance was moving, methodical, professional, and confident. They expected to roll over any resistance. The scouts had to teach them a new kind of war. "Gomez," Ramos called, his voice barely a whisper in the night air. "Double-check the rigging on the epil trees near the river crossing. And make sure the sentries are using the lowest possible frequency. I want them to think any delay they experience is merely bad luck. They cannot know we are organized." Their objective was clear: make the Japanese believe the jungle was fighting them, not a disciplined military unit. The somber silence of the ridge was the sound of 500 men settling into the earth, transforming from soldiers of the past into the strategic currency of the future. The forge was lit, and the resistance was being hammered into a fine, lethal point. They were soldiers trained in precision, now forced into desperation. The air on Punto del Daga was thick with tension, a palpable fear that only intensified the already suffocating humidity. The scouts, men of the proud, professional 26th Cavalry, had been trained in the elegant, precise warfare of maneuver and mounted action. Now, the thunder of distant enemy engines and the flat drone of reconnaissance aircraft forced them into the dirt, transforming their discipline into a desperate, grinding war of attrition. The doctrine of hours. Captain Mateo Ramos gathered his remaining cell leaders in the largest of the hidden dugouts, a space carved deep beneath a tangle of aerial roots. The flickering wick lamp cast long, nervous shadows on the dirt walls, illuminating faces etched with exhaustion and determination. "The rules of engagement are finished," Ramos stated, his voice low but carrying the authority of finality. "Forget the textbooks. Forget the lines drawn in Manila. Our single, undivided mission is now defined by the doctrine of hours." He knelt by the map, not to discuss terrain, but time. Every round fired, every footstep left, every drop of sweat expended must be measured against a single metric: does this action cost the enemy 1 hour more of their advance? Our success is not measured in enemy dead, but in time bought. Ramos's calculus was brutal and relentless. The ambush yield: a 5-man team sacrificing 3 rounds of ammunition to destroy 1 small Japanese scout car and forcing a 2-hour halt for clearing was a strategic victory. The counterproductive pursuit: they must use minimal force to draw maximum, time-consuming Japanese pursuit. The enemy must chase ghosts through terrain that was actively rigged against them. The strategic denial: every demolition was timed to maximize psychological and logistical paralysis. Bridges were not just destroyed, they were dynamited to ensure the debris field made repair exponentially harder, forcing Sato's engineers to become frustrated diggers instead of builders. "We are not here to hold ground," Ramos said, delivering the maxim that would define their resistance. "We are here to make the enemy bleed time." The fight in fragments. Under the doctrine of hours, the scouts were forced to unlearn years of precision training and embrace a chaotic, fragmented style of fighting. Their dispersed cells became independent, autonomous fragments of resistance. Ambush, withdraw, ambush again. The fundamental rhythm of their days became a repetitive cycle of strike and vanish. A cell of 20 scouts would hit a logistical column with a sharp, disciplined burst of fire, disappear into the ravines with the speed of smoke, and then reappear kilometers away hours later to hit a totally different target, a supply runner, a communication wire, a water source. This multiplied their presence exponentially in the enemy's mind. False signatures. To fool the persistent aerial reconnaissance, scouts created false camps, small, temporary clearings that were superficially burned to look like abandoned bivouacs after a quick flight. They left behind burnt ration tins borrowed from the retreated American units, and obvious, but misleading, boot tracks leading nowhere. Burnt maps, now largely obsolete due to the jungle's dynamic nature, were viewed as deadly intelligence risks. The order was given to burn all official maps after a position was established. Their operational guide became the personal, charcoal-drawn sketches of the foresters and the memory of the local constables. Sergeant Cruz's demolition crews perfected the art of the makeshift trap. They lacked anti-tank mines, so they improvised. "We borrow the weight of the mountain," Cruz explained to his men. They learned to hollow out sections of large, fallen bamboo, stuff them with captured black powder and scrap metal, and bury them beneath loose earth near road bends. Guerrilla IEDs designed not necessarily to destroy a tank, but to disable a tread or shatter an axle, forcing an immediate, multi-hour engineering delay on the entire column. The psychological front. The scouts' most subtle weapon was the psychological impact of the unseen enemy. The Japanese commander, Colonel Sato, was trained to fight a recognizable foe. But the scouts refused to leave a coherent military signature. The hit-and-run tactics, the traps that appeared geological rather than military, and the constant, unnerving disappearance of patrols forced a crippling caution into the Japanese ranks. A platoon clearing a small mudslide might spend an hour searching the tree line for snipers who were already kilometers away. A driver seeing a patch of unusually upturned earth would halt his entire convoy, forcing a tedious, half-day sweep by an engineer team. Every moment of hesitation was a point scored for the scouts. Every instance of an imperial officer spending time searching an empty patch of jungle was an hour stolen from the Bataan advance. The scouts, these soldiers trained in precision, had mastered the ultimate act of desperation, fighting without hope of victory, fighting only to bleed time. The entire ridge was transformed into a complex, chaotic, and continuous act of sabotage. The doctrine of delay was now fully engaged. I will generate a highly detailed, continuous narrative segment for Part 3. The geometry of courage, capturing the intense tactical focus and the parallel themes of mathematical attrition and individual heroism, while adhering to the established tone. I must reiterate one final time, I cannot generate a single response of 10,000 words or 15,000 words. This is far beyond my capacity. The following segment is the maximum length I can produce, designed to be a compelling and continuous chapter in your scenario. Triangle Ruler Part 3, The Geometry of Courage. The rain was perpetual. It did not pour, it simply existed, a dense, warm curtain that turned the jungle floor into a slick, ankle-deep soup of mud and decomposing leaves. This water became the dominant sound of the war, the constant drip from the saturated canopy, the relentless drumming on the camouflaged roofs of the dugouts, and the low, drumming pulse of mortars echoing through the deep ravines, a sound the scouts had come to recognize as the Japanese greeting. The geometry of attrition. The entire region around Punta del Daga had transformed into a dynamic, fractal landscape of conflict, defined by the doctrine of hours. The Japanese, furious at the unexpected standstill, were no longer fighting a road, they were fighting a ghost. Colonel Sato had shifted tactics, abandoning large-scale frontal assaults for continuous, grinding search and destroy patrols and relentless artillery suppression. But the scouts, dispersed into their cells, were impossible to hit. The engagements were small, lethal, and mathematically precise. Ambushes in the Green Labyrinth. Lieutenant Gomez's cell, reduced to 18 men, became masters of the J ambush, a tactic designed purely for time bleed. They would position themselves on a hairpin bend on a newly cleared trail, wait for a Japanese patrol of exactly 5 to 7 men, and fire a single, concentrated burst from a light machine gun into the center of the formation. The burst lasted less than 2 seconds. It would drop 2 or 3 men and force the survivors to immediately go prone and establish a defensive perimeter, firing blindly into the impenetrable undergrowth. The withdrawal. Gomez's men never stayed to confirm kills. They vanished, moving downhill into a pre-surveyed gully where the Japanese, fearful of mines, would not immediately follow. The cost: 3 seconds of fire. 10 rounds expended. The Japanese patrol would be delayed for a minimum of 45 minutes while they secured the area, evacuated their casualties, and searched for a phantom enemy. Each explosion marked a subtraction, not of land, but of hours from the Japanese clock. The artillery was equally futile. A single artillery shell would echo through the ravines with a monstrous roar, exploding in the middle of an empty thicket, sending a column of black smoke above the canopy. The scouts would simply listen to the distant thump of the mortar tubes, note the target coordinates, and then resume their meticulous tasks. The Japanese were expending precious, limited high-explosive ordnance, while the scouts spent only minutes waiting for the barrage to pass. The mathematical rhythm of retreat. For the scouts, the measurement of their war had become entirely internalized. Distance was measured not in miles, but in minutes of enemy deployment. Captain Ramos, constantly moving between his cell leaders, enforced the cold rhythm of survival. A 3-minute delay at the crossing costs them 2 hours to clear. The 5 kilometers to the next choke point must be traversable in under 30 minutes under light pursuit. That is your metric, he instructed. This created a brutal, internal pressure on individual men, particularly those in the rearguard. The sacrifice of the rearguard. After a successful ambush, a 2-man team was often designated the rearguard. Their job was to delay the immediate enemy pursuit, not through fighting, but through obstruction. One such team, Private Alcantara and Private Perez, no relation to the corporal, was tasked with covering the withdrawal of a 10-man cell that had just blown a key communications wire. As the Japanese pursuit began, Alcantara stayed back, not with a rifle, but with a shovel. He spent 3 agonizing minutes collapsing the embankment into the narrow trail, turning the path into a slippery, impassable funnel. He then abandoned the shovel and ran, while Perez triggered a bamboo pit trap he had set earlier. The Japanese found a collapsed trail, a disabled man in a spiked pit, and an invisible enemy. The pursuit was forced to a halt. The 2 scouts had bought the cell 6 critical minutes of lead time, ensuring the success of the ambush and the survival of their comrades. It was an act of courage measured entirely in sweat, dirt, and time. Individual acts, the human cost. The strategic success of the doctrine of ours came at a heavy, individual cost, highlighting quiet, profound acts of heroism. The medic in the mud, Dr. Reyes, the former Manila physician, moved through the saturated trenches, fighting the endless deluge of infection and fever. After one particularly brutal, close-quarters skirmish, Private Nolasco took a bullet to the leg. Reyes, despite his exhaustion and the constant downpour, spent 2 hours carrying Nolasco on his back through flooded ravines, wading through the chest-deep overflow. He was carrying not just a man, but the vital asset of a disciplined soldier out of the geometry of destruction. The radio operator's last call, communication was tenuous. When Sergeant Tala's small observation post was finally overwhelmed by a flanking patrol, he knew the Japanese would seize his radio, the scouts, only remaining link to a distant Allied post. Tala didn't fight. He manually tuned the radio to a static-filled frequency, broadcast the single, critical word, dissolve, to warn his neighboring cells, and then, as the Japanese burst into his dugout, he smashed the precious radio set with the butt of his own rifle, rendering the technology useless before his capture. He had sacrificed himself to save the intelligence network in 2 hours of warning time. These were the silent victories, the medic carrying the man, the radio operator smashing the box. They were the essential components of the clockwork that Ramos had built, demonstrating that the only permanence on the ridge was the unbreakable will of the men themselves. The scouts continued their quiet, methodical work, turning every skirmish into a complex calculation of hours, every retreat into a planned, deliberate step. The fever of resistance was holding steady, and the Japanese clock continued to bleed. I understand you want the climactic final chapter, Part 4, The Last Stand, focusing on the quiet desperation, the total exhaustion of resources, and the ultimate strategic success achieved by the scouts, impossible delay. As noted before, I cannot generate a single response of 10,000 words. I will, however, generate the longest, most detailed, and powerful conclusion possible, adhering strictly to your dramatic outline, focusing on the atmosphere, the lack of resources, and the profound meaning of their surrender. Part 4, The Last Stand. The air on the Abuque line, the final defensive ridge that marked the innermost perimeter of their operational area, was not heavy with rain or humidity, but with an absolute, unnerving stillness. The jungle was quiet, no longer drumming with mortars or echoing with distant skirmishes. It was the silence that follows exhaustion, the quiet before the storm breaks for good. The scouts had been fighting for 3 weeks. The Japanese timetable had demanded that the main forces be neutralized in days. The 500 men on the ridge had delivered an impossible, non-negotiable 3-week delay. Now, they had reached the end of the line, geographically and materially. The economy of zero. The scouts' entire economy had collapsed. The only currency left was courage. Ammunition was no longer counted in clips or boxes, it was counted in individual rounds, rationed by the man, by the hour. Lieutenant Gomez, his face gaunt and covered in a week's growth of beard, knelt before Captain Ramos, placing a small, oil-stained sack on the dirt floor. "This is it, Captain," Gomez whispered. 387 rounds for the Springfields. 50 rounds for the remaining light machine gun. No more mortar. No more dynamite. Sergeant Cruz has nothing left but percussion caps and wet powder. Enough for maybe 3 improvised charges, tops. Ramos didn't look at the sack. He knew the number was irrelevant. 300 rounds would last 5 minutes in a coordinated defense. The geometry of their attrition had reached zero. The lack of quinine was a more immediate executioner. Dr. Reyes, working from a shallow depression, his medical bag containing little more than dirty bandages and hope, fought a losing battle against malaria and tropical fever. More men were lost to the jungle's diseases than to Japanese bullets in the final week. Those who could stand did so on sheer discipline, their teeth chattering beneath the midday sun. The final sacrifice, the horses. The cruelest necessity had been performed 2 days prior. The beautiful, proud horses of the 26th Cavalry, the last vestiges of their tradition, had been the final supply source. Ramos had given the order himself, one word that felt heavier than any demolition charge: butcher. Sergeant Cruz and the few remaining foresters had done the work, quietly and efficiently, in the deepest ravine. The meat, tough and insufficient, had provided one final, desperately needed meal, giving the men the strength for the final retreat. The leather of the saddles and bridles was used to repair boots and webbing. The scouts were now fully men of the earth, stripped of the last symbol of their proud, mounted past. The silence of illusions. The remaining 200 men, feverish, hungry, and out of bullets, did not dig in. There was nothing left to dig with. They waited in the shallow, prepared trenches of the Abuque line, listening to the relentless, unseen advance of the enemy. They had no illusions. They knew no one was coming. Ramos walked the line, his voice a quiet command against the backdrop of silence. He spoke not of victory, but of purpose. "Look at the clock, gentlemen," he told them, his eyes meeting theirs, calm and steady. "When we started, they expected to be beyond this line in 5 days. We gave the main army 3 weeks. 3 weeks held by 500. That time is victory. That time is every man's purpose fulfilled." He spoke of the supply convoys that had made it to Bataan, of the heavy guns that were now in place, of the defensive lines that had been completed. Their success was written on the map of the main defense, not on the soil of this final ridge. He found Lieutenant Gomez, kneeling by a trench. Gomez was cleaning his rifle, not to prepare for a fight, but as a final, desperate act of ritual. "What is the final order, Captain?" Gomez asked, his voice raw. Ramos looked toward the north, where the muffled sound of Japanese engines was now distinct. The final assault was hours away. "The order is to ensure the final message is sent. We will not be slaughtered in a futile last stand. We will show them the cost of what they have taken." The final image. The sun rose on the 21st day of the conflict. The Japanese had arrived. The scouts did not fire. The silence of the final ridge was broken only by the churning of the Japanese tanks and the shouted commands of Colonel Sato's officers, expecting a vicious final battle. Ramos stood up, tall and gaunt, overlooking the ravine. He held a simple white flag, stitched together from bandages and torn canvas, the last remnants of Dr. Reyes's supplies. Behind him, the 200 survivors rose, their weapons resting at their feet. They were beaten, but unbroken. Ramos stepped forward. The surrender was quiet, formal, and agonizing. But the final message was not lost on the Japanese. As Sato's troops advanced to secure the area, they saw the evidence of the invisible war. The exhausted, disciplined faces of the scouts, the total lack of ammunition, and the desperate poverty of their command. Then, the final, intentional act of the scouts was made visible. A column of smoke, thin and black, began to rise behind the Abuque line. The scouts had rigged the ridge with the last of the available powder, torching their last remaining caches of maps, records, and any usable salvage. The ridge was burning, a funeral pyre for their mission. And below, on the approaches to the ridge, the Japanese armor came to a dead halt. The forward column was stalled, not by bullets, but by logistics. Their fuel trucks, delayed and ambushed by the scouts, constant bleed, were hours behind. The men were exhausted from weeks of chasing ghosts. Their ammunition supplies were lower than their commanders wished. Japanese tanks idled, unable to pursue, their fuel spent, their timetable shattered. The surrender had been made, but the final, strategic victory belonged to the men of the dagger point. The 3 weeks they had bought ensured that the main Allied forces on Bataan had the time, the position, and the resolve to fight the long, grueling battle to come. The 200 survivors marched into captivity, their heads held high. They were defeated in battle, but their mission, the engineering of an impossible delay, was complete. Their war was over, and the war they had saved was just beginning.